You're listening to Say the World, an international writing podcast. My name is Mike Meginnis. I'm the communications coordinator at the International Writing Program.
And I'm Christopher Merrill, the director of the IWP, as we call it.
This week, we are mostly going to be talking with Busisiwe Mahlangu, who is a poet, playwright, and fiction writer from South Africa. For this conversation, you were out of town. So we had the good fortune, though, that actually in the office behind me as I speak, we work with Romeo Oriogun, who is a poet of great acclaim and accomplishment himself. And so he sat in for the interview and was a natural. I basically let him take over. I basically was not particularly involved in this one, but I was really enjoying listening. And that was my main contribution.
Why not? Romeo has an expert handle on writing throughout Africa. He himself is from Nigeria and was very much in tune with Busi.
It was funny. She said that she had basically finished one short story and published it somewhere. And he was like, "Oh yeah, that was a great story."
Yeah.
I remember reading that. It was like, "Oh wow, yeah, you're at another level of familiarity. I'm jealous." This was also the conversation that we recorded from the 2023 residency where we laughed by far the most. I was actually really nervous that it would be hard to edit because laughter echoes in these rooms. And it was like, I don't know what this is going to be when I get to it, but it turned out really well.
Laughter is the best medicine for writers, too.
One special thing that I want to note about this is we begin with Busi's poetry, which she generally writes in English, and so there's no translation there. But then at the end of this episode, you'll hear a poem that she wrote in Zulu, for which there is no translation into English currently, or there wasn't at the time of recording. So it's just a little special treat. You get to hear the music of probably an unfamiliar language to you, and I really enjoyed that.
And what that does is to remind us that she is yet another poet who's operating in one language, but in fact, there's another language or two or three behind everything that she writes in English, and that makes for a richer work.
Absolutely. Another thing that kind of related to that we talked about a fair amount is the sort of different discursive registers that are brought to her work by the experience of having read in more performance oriented environments and then writing with those in mind after the fact. And that's something that has come up with other people we spoke with as well. That was a conversation that we had with Soonest Nathaniel.
She's writing not just for the page, but also for the stage, and that shapes every decision she makes rhythmically and in terms of the imagery she's following through the course of the poem.
One of the things that has been really interesting to me to learn about in working here, and I think I talk about this in the interview as well, is the differences in cultures when it comes to readings, performances, giving performative readings in public, which we treat at the IWP as one of the sort of main culminating efforts that you do while you're here, right? Because in the US, we have a very reading focused literary culture. This, despite the fact that generally speaking, my experience is that most people don't really love being present for readings. Like most people don't want to listen to them, and writers do enjoy giving them, but often not quite enough to put in the sort of effort that somebody like Busi does to make sure that it's a good experience for the audience.
Exactly.
Is there a time or a place that you have particularly enjoyed giving a reading?
Oh, I often love giving readings, but I'm remembering one right now, even as you were saying that. We had a very small crowd. This poet went on for so long that people started drifting away, and by the time that reading was over, I looked around and there was only one person left, and I said, well, I guess I don't have to read tonight.
You had been freed from the obligation. Yeah, I mean, this is what writers talk about when we talk about readings in the U.S. mostly, right? It's like
the worst reading.
Yeah, and all the people, it's almost always the same story. It's the person who who took too long, who went too far. The one
That's the unforgivable sin.
Yes.
Yes.
The one that kills me is when I was in grad school, everybody would do a sort of culminating reading at the end of their 3 years there. It was a 3-year program, and they would give a reading, and it was sort of an introduction to a visiting writer, right? It was part of our visiting writers series, and so I think you and I would assume that the norm is you don't read for that long because there's somebody who's a bigger deal than you who needs some time, and you don't know how long they're gonna take.
Yeah.
But we had this one person in particular. Of course, we were students, so like people were flagrantly violating the sort of contract all over the place. But there was one person in particular who wrote a letter to his graduating class, which was itself longer than most short stories. And he read the letter, and then he said, "And now I will read my story." And he read the story, and then the visiting writer went too long. Like, he gave a reading that was on its own inappropriately lengthy, and by the end of that, I wanted to die.
Yeah, yeah. But here, by way of contrast, the really wonderful novelist and short story writer Bob Shakochis, when we were really young, he was a waiter at the Breadloaf Writers Conference, and they would host a reading every few days, and they had 3 minutes apiece. But his stories were quite long. So he bought the time from 6 other writers, 3 minutes apiece. And the fact of the matter is, the story was so great, everybody was on their seat, at the edge of their seats the entire time. And I thought, this guy, he's gonna do great things in the writing world.
Did he announce that he had made the purchase? Was that part of the
Oh yeah, yeah,
performance?
yeah. He had done that. But the guy who was running the thing was my late friend, the Kashmiri poet Aga Shahid Ali, and he said he bought 18 minutes worth and he still went 19 minutes. I said, but Shahid, everybody loved the reading. It's okay.
That's really good. Well, let's get right to Boosie.
This poem is titled Violation, and it is from my book Surviving Lost. My anger is a log in a fire. Did not start the flame but burned. Soon, there'll be no one to blame when I turn to ash. The inferno in my chest is a prison. A person who's had me before cannot do it again. I have them drink the fuel they poured on my feet. This anger did not start the flame, but that explosion is all of it, all of me. My anger bent my tears. My anger molded my chest a shield. My anger taught my breath to be gasoline. No one fought for me. My anger did. Fought for the woman in my blood and the children. Never touched the fire, but they feel the warmth. This is protection. This is a volcano erupting to save us. This is titled Undoing a River. I begin each morning stretching my arms, counting parts of me that escaped the night. My body is in salt water, but nothing can heal it. I lay my body on the floor and start fixing. I pull it out of the water. I dig it out of a wound. It bleeds out on the mat, and I say, it's not your fault the pain swallows you. Every morning, I check my body for intruders. I dig into the sores, make a difficult place to live in. All this medicine made my body strange. All the prayers made it sink. My body belongs to anyone trying to save it. My mama and her church, so I let them have it. My mama and her church, so I let them have it. With their prayers and salt water. But my body makes love when it belongs to me. I know a body makes love even when it is sick. The undoing of a river is a waterfall. A body makes love. My name is Busisiwe Mahlangu. I am a writer, poet, performer, playwright, short fiction writer from Mamelodi. I tend to do many things because as a freelancer, I tend to believe that I have so much time and then I try something new. So when I'm not writing, I run a jewelry business. I make earrings, I make neck pieces, I make bracelets. Something that I feel feeds into my writing. Sometimes when I'm beading, it will just cross my mind to be like, oh, I need to write this poem. And when I'm writing, I feel like it channels back into the beading. So I think when it comes to art, I feel like it's just the same frequency no matter what you're creating or the medium. So I just allow myself to experiment even in new genres that I've never tapped into before. I am from Mamelodi. I grew up in a township called Mamelodi. It's actually just means mother of melodies. I don't sing, I just write, but I think the music of the space, because it's such a jazz township, really influenced my writing. I think of myself as a feminist. I think of myself as a Pan Africanist. I want to make work that makes people resonate and actually connects different people.
Well, thank you for joining us. I thought I would ask this later, but since you brought it up, I feel like it's a good thing to ask now. I was interested in looking at your jewelry work and thinking about how it connected with your other creative practices. I was curious, like, what your experience is of creating jewelry, what it provides to you that writing poetry or other forms doesn't, and also what it has in common with those forms.
So I would say I started just creating jewelry for myself as a performer. I wanted to look nice on stage. I had a bald head and I felt like, wow, big earrings would actually be beautiful while I'm on stage performing, and started watching some few YouTube videos. They did not have the big, extra colorful style that I was looking for, but it did teach me some techniques. And I started making for myself. When I went to performances, people would ask, hey, where did you get your earrings? I made them. Oh my God, you should sell them. So I think it's mostly the audience that gave me the idea to make the jewelry and sell it. But I did not do that initially. I just did it for friends and they came back with the feedback. People want this jewelry. So in terms of audience, I would say most of the people who would get my jewelry will be the artists, and it will be from the spaces where I perform, because I'll bring my book along with my earrings and set up a table and sell it. But that is the finished product. The creating process of it is that, like, beading allows me to listen to music, to listen to a book, to listen to poetry performances. So in practice, I feel like that is connected, especially as a consumer of art. While I'm creating, then I can listen to a poem or listen to an audiobook or a podcast. So yeah, so I tend to just stop beading and then go and write and then come back to bead again.
Okay, that's interesting. So now let's get into poetry.
Hmm.
I still remember the first time I heard about you. It was a few years ago. Bash Amunani. I think he went to South Africa
Poetry
for
Africa.
Poetry
Mm.
Africa. And I remember him being there because I was already in the States. And he was like, hey, you need to listen to this person and read her poems, because I'm always on the lookout for poems, poetry, poets, anything that has to do with poetry on the continent. And I remember reading some of your poems and listening to some of them, the ones I could hear you perform. I think I wanted to ask, what does silence do for you in your poems? Because I think your poems talk about the body a lot, talks about healing and what the body has survived, whether it's generational or present. But in all of that, there's a silence that I find in your poem. I remember one of the lines that stood out to me was talking about, my grandmother survived this and my mother survived this, and now I have a scar. And I think about scar and I think about silence also, like the silence of a scar. It's present, but it's so, it doesn't say anything other than what it is. So I wanted to ask, what does silence do for you as a poet, and how do you use it when writing? Because it's so present in your work, and it's done in a way that's so brilliant and so powerful to
Wow,
witness.
thank you. And that is a very heavy question. But I'll just start by saying the few lines you mentioned. My mother's mother has done the suffering for my mother. My mother has done the suffering for me. This is how I inherit a scar. So silence for me, I feel when I first started writing, all I wanted to do was get all my ideas, no matter how bad they are on paper. I just wanted to write and take up the writing space as a space where I can speak. So from that point, I felt like writing was giving me sort of a space to not be silenced, to explore my ideas, to say what I stand for, to take my position in matters, open space for conversation. It allowed me to do that. And I think because the space was available to me in a time when I felt like I couldn't have the space to speak, that reflects in my work, that there is always that hunger, that am I saying the right thing? Am I not saying the right thing? When do I keep quiet? When do I speak? And yeah, I think it's still like an ongoing investigation with myself as a writer, but as well as a performer. Most of my poems, the way they look on paper, is actually shaped by how they sound to me as a performer or when I'm on stage performing them. The pause becomes a line break, and if the pause is so big, I'm like, oh, why don't we just take this weight and throw it to the other side of the paper and see what that looks visually on paper. So I try to reflect that silence, the pause on paper like that. I don't know if it's working for the readers, but I imagine they're sitting there reading, and then there's this big space that allows them to breathe in, and then they keep going. So yeah, I think as well, like I've come to realize that sometimes silence is necessary. Sometimes a pause is necessary. Like you don't always have to speak, and you don't always have to fill the space. That sometimes things can just
It's
be.
amazing. I think before Mike asks the next question, I wanted to ask a follow up question. You spoke about performance, like stage, and I mean it's all over your work. It's one of the brilliant thing about your work. I think like with the South African poetry scene, there's this intersection between poetry on the page and poetry being performed. And it's done in this very beautiful way that you can't distinguish one from the other except you witness it. And I keep thinking of that lineage of performance and page, whether it's yourself, whether it's Koleka, whether it's Yomi Sode in the UK, Daniel Smith in the US. There seems to be this kind of like renaissance in the past 10 years of poetry being performed and poetry being written by certain poets. And I wanted to ask you, where does that come from for you? What's the lineage and how do you balance it? Because it's a difficult thing to do. As someone who writes poem myself, it's so difficult to, you know, perform and then write the same thing.
I started poetry when I was in primary school. It was just submissions into youth magazines. Like our English teacher was encouraging us to write and submit. And I think of that period of my life as like I was just imitating poetry. Anything I could find that I liked, I tried to write something similar. And I felt bad at that point, especially when one of the pieces got published. I felt so bad because I wanted to explain to people that no, I didn't really write it, but I wrote it, but I didn't. But also just being a kid felt like, oh, maybe I should keep it to myself. Should I tell them? And I just remember struggling with that. Yeah. So, and I think like that stage in primary school where I was imitating art was very important because where I was imitating the poetry that I was reading because I was a scholar without even realizing. I was reading and when I liked it, I tried to write. So like I feel like my entry into poetry was the page. And when I was in grade 7, my English teacher was like, you don't want to read this in front of the assembly. So I went home and I memorized the poem and I performed it in front of the school because I thought that was what was expected from me. I didn't know that I could have just read it from the piece of paper
That's really interesting.
because I thought like it will be similar to what we do with like presentations in class. Like you have to know your speech and
Yeah.
then you deliver what you. So that was my transition into the stage. And then in high school, I was part of the poetry sessions in our school, which was like informal. And we will just meet up every week and we will share songs. Singers will sing, poets will poet. Sometimes there'll be a dancer or a rapper. And it was just such a beautiful space. Fast forward to high school, I go to university, at Wits University. I do engineering. Do not ask me about that. I didn't even finish it but I'm so glad it happened. And while I was in Joburg, I learned that there's poetry competitions, poetry slams, and that's when I enter into the spoken word culture. And it's something that I have been doing. I've been writing and memorizing my pieces, but what was lacking was the performer aspect of it. I feel like it was just the writing and my voice that was involved in the performance. And I had to learn to actually get my body involved into the reading as well. Because I just used to perform there, like my hands by the side of my legs, and I'll just be like, da, 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 and I'll do the pieces. And I was really awkward on stage, and I had to learn to be a performer. It's a hard thing to balance, especially in the world of poetry slams, because as much as you're writing the poems for yourself and you understand these poems are yours, at the back of your head, there's always that idea that these poems are going to get judged, they are going to get scored, and you need to have something that will actually capture the judges and the audiences, and you need to be memorable and you need to be spectacular, and there's like just so much expectation. So I felt like that was a moment where I used to struggle, because sometimes, especially the way I approach poetry, I want it to be simple but still has like I don't know how to explain this. I want to play with language, but I want the language to still be simple, but I want to play with it. I want to stretch it and still have the poem be understood, you
Mm.
know? So I don't want my poems to be so far away from people to access, but still I want to be an artist and play and experiment and be creative. So it was hard because sometimes you will be creative and the audience will miss the line that you thought they're gonna like, and you're there on stage and it's sort of discouraging or disturbing. You're like, this is the line where people were supposed to clip and then they were supposed to shout and go crazy. So yeah, the stage is nice. You get instant feedback from the audience, especially if it's an audience like the South African audience. They will engage with you when you're on stage. They will not keep quiet and watch you unless they don't like what you're delivering. But if they like it and you're on stage, you will know. So that's what I liked. And then the page, like, you never know on the page if someone else is gonna like it or not. You send it to journals, it gets rejected, and then you're like, is this a bad poem? Is it a good poem? So yeah, the stage is very, I feel more isolated as a writer on page. The stage is more engaging. It gives you feedback. You give them energy, they give it back. It's so interactive. It's addictive, in fact.
Yeah, there's an element of interaction with things that are written too, right? But you don't have the same, like you're saying, you don't have the same feedback when you're performing for an audience. There's the paired pressures. Like I'm just summarizing basically what you said. The idea that, like, on the one hand you need to demonstrate and perform virtuosity because that's what sets you apart from the competition. But on the other hand, the audience will not even know that you have done anything virtuosic unless they're able to kind of come along with you, right? That's what makes them able to recognize the line that they're going to clap for, they're going to snap or whatever, is the fact that you have written it in a way that allows them to kind of do it with you, right? And I feel like that is, though, a really undervalued skill in writing things on the page, knowing that there is an audience member who is reading who actually does have to do that same work of doing the lines along with you, creating the poem as they read it with you, and like creating that space for them to do that. So I was interested in that because in at least one interview you gave the advice to young writers who are interested in poetry of go out and do open mics and learn from that experience. That kind of answers the question that I wanted to ask about it, which is like what they would get out of that,
Mm.
right? Something I wondered about in relationship to that is your bio mentions that you have performed in a lot of different places, right? In examples were Mozambique, Nigeria, Sweden, and the US. And I'm curious because, especially working at IWP, I become aware all the time of all these like blind spots I have, all these ways in which I'm a little parochial or whatever, right? And one is that I didn't appreciate fully how different reading cultures are, like the performance of reading a literary work in different places. And I wonder what your experience has been, what you've learned from performing, from reading for people in all these different spaces and all these different cultures.
Yeah, I think it's gonna come back to what we spoke about, silence. So the first time I performed outside of South Africa was in Sweden, and like the audience was quiet,
Uh-huh.
really, really quiet. I could even tell when I'm like stepping on my B's, when I'm like, "Boo, boo," and the mic echoes back like the B's and the P's. Like I could hear that kind of feedback while I'm on stage because they were so quiet, and I just had to keep going. And that has actually made me realize I've performed in like all kinds of places. I've performed in taverns, I've performed in clubs, I've performed in coffee shops, I've performed in very, I don't know, corporate kind of venues where everyone is so serious about the events of the day, and in art spaces. So I think what I know is that as a writer, my job on stage is to channel the poem. Even if like the audience, even if I have a small moment where I think the audience is not responding or they don't understand what I'm saying, I have to keep going. And I learned that when I was in Sweden. Even though I've had experiences in South Africa where I'll get to a place and the audience will be quiet, I never had to do it back to back to actually see that, oh, this is the culture of this particular space. But then we got to Stockholm, and there's a poetry organization called Revolution Poetry, and we got there, and it was like black people and people of color in the room, and then we performed, and you could just see their replies, and you could just see them feel the poem. So different cultures experience the pieces differently, experience art differently. And it is also what I'm learning. It is also an honor sometimes for people to just keep quiet and listen and not be part of the piece or scream or shout or clap their hands, but just sit and listen. It's also active, even if it's not loud, it's active. And I have grown to become very grateful for that because sometimes I really just want the audience to shut up.
Oh, well, that's interesting. And speaking of performance, your collection, Surviving Loss, was adapted for theater. I was like doing some research of trying to like look at that
Yeah.
process, but also, what it means. I wanted to ask what it means to you to have your work because I mean, having poetry adapted, which is also a very South African thing. Of course, I've seen like about 3 or 4 poets who their work get adapted for
Yeah.
theater. I'm always jealous of that, by the way. But I wanted to ask what the journey was like for you. I also know that you made certain demands. It has to be a young black woman. It has to, you know, and I know that you're a feminist, but I wanted to ask, what was that process? What did it mean for you to be seen that way and your work to be shown that way also?
So when we adopted Surviving Loss, it was so exciting because I get to take up the role of a producer, and I got to decide like who makes it into the cast, and then who directs, and also I get to perform my pieces on stage with the cast. It was actually beautiful, you know. It was, oh my word, I'm thinking back now, I miss it. It was so beautiful. Firstly, as an artist who at the time I was just working full time as an artist, to be given a budget and say, here, execute your vision, and then being able to approach people knowing that you have something to give them was, it was nice. It made me realize that I want to do art, I want to do writing with the financial backing because it's easier than without the financial backing.
Yes, I also would like to do it with the financial
I
backing.
want that. Oh, and yeah, so it was just freeing because then I could really, really approach people that I wanted to collaborate with. And luckily they said yes. So we rehearsed for like almost 2 months back to back. And closer to the staging, we were the week of the stage, we were just coming back home late at night, and I was like, this is so unhealthy. And I really felt bad for my cast, but they kept pushing me. They're like, no, we must get this right. That process really grew me as a performer. We will have like open rehearsals where the theater staff would sit in, and like these are people who know what makes a good show because they are running the theater, and they will just sit in and watch the production, and afterwards they'll give us like this long list of feedback, and I will want to cry. But then just having a team that was like, oh yeah, no, we can, because I was struggling with with some of the poems, and they were like so encouraging. No, we can figure it out, and how to merge the dance and the music. So it was like a 3-cast play, and we had dance, music, and poetry. But what we did is that we took the poems and created like a fragmented story with them, and like they were connecting and tried to build characters around the existing poetry. So even like the scripting of that process was exciting because I got to see more possibilities for the work, that they can exist like this. It can be an actual story. We can link them together. We can build a new world with existing work. I really love that. I enjoyed it, to be honest.
It's okay if like a specific example doesn't come to mind because this is maybe a little in the weeds, but I wonder if there is a particular example of like a thing you talked about the process of like trying over and over again to get something to feel right. Do you remember any like particular thing that was a sticking point? Like what kind of problem kept coming up and how you ended up solving it?
So what happened was that I was a very serious performer, like very serious. And my director was saying that, you know what, you need to like loosen up. I was like, very, and everything I'll perform, I'll just perform it with my hands, but the rest of my body will not engage into the piece. And so during rehearsals, I had to do a lot of silly things. I had to perform my poem while running around our rehearsal space. And then I had to do my poem really fast until I ran out of breath. And then I had to do it really slow until I got bored of it. And every time it's like my director always had like these weird things and she was pulling them out of her head, I thought. And she would just do this. And I was just always so worried about rehearsals. I'm like, oh, what weird thing am I gonna do today? So I think that was it. Like my entire body was not engaging in the piece because I was so used to performing in front of a mic stand or holding the mic in my hand. But then when it came to theater, like my whole body had to be involved. There was no mic stand. The story was not like I was not performing the piece standing in one place. I had to keep moving all over the stage because the story, the way we had designed it was moving and it involved movement. So even myself, I was expected, even though I'm not a dancer, I was expected to contribute to that movement, to be part of the story so that everything gels together. So I think that was the hardest part to, shake it out, shake out that awkwardness and let the body be part of the story.
It is a huge difference, right? Like when I'm preparing for a reading, there will always be like those 2 or 3 points where I'm like, and this is where I'll look up or this is where I'll like gesture, I'll point at something or I'll count like 1, 2, 3 with my fingers. And those are huge gestures in the context of reading into a microphone behind a podium. And they are not huge gestures on stage. So that makes sense that there'd be a long unlocking process to get to the point where you're like engaging with that space and that environment and that audience. That's really I feel for you.
Yeah. And I think it made me realize that you can be the writer, but then once you get into rehearsals, you need to stop. Okay, maybe you don't need to stop, but like you need to realize that now you are a performer in rehearsal and this is a script. Yes, you can change it, but this is a script and you must narrate the script. You are translating the work that is on page. You're translating it for the stage, and it made me realize that um rehearsals are good. You're gonna feel silly, you're gonna feel like you don't know what you're doing and whatever, but the more you do it, that's actually how you unlock better way of performance. And now I'm like in two communities. I'm with the spoken word communities and I'm with the readers.
Oh, wow, the readers.
And I feel like, oh my God, thank God there's a community where we can just read our poems because I really needed that pressure to be taken off.
Yeah.
Welcome, welcome to the boring side of life.
Sometimes it's necessary, Sometimes like I wrote this poem and I just want to read it. I don't want to do the theatrics. I don't want to perform it. This is the piece. It's either you like it as it is or you don't.
Yeah.
I get you. I really do get you because I mean, I don't know how to do the performance also. I just put my head down on the podium and just read.
But you read beautifully.
I think
You read so beautiful. We were crying at Perry Lights. I'm like, what are you doing to us?
I try. Anyway,
Enough of these compliments. We have to move on.
You talked about movement earlier on, and I'm interested about how that movement have happened for you in poetry. I'm also interested in the local work you do in South Africa with, I might butcher this,
Lwazi Lubanzi.
Luazulubans. I almost wanted to call it like Luazulubanzi.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, Lwazi Lubanzi.
So I'm thinking about the work you do there, the work of poetry as a tool for healing. And I always think about healing as this movement from one space to another. It has to do with whether it's social movements, whether it's one that allows you to tap into what you cannot do before, and find a way through life. I'm also thinking about movement as this very Pan Africanist idea of healing among ourselves, especially now in which we've never been more divided as we are right now. Sure, like on the continent. So I'm thinking, what do you see your poetry doing in that aspect? What does movement in this, as it pertains to healing, as it pertains to poetry, or whatever you think movement is? What does that mean to you as a person? Whether it's like local with what you do in Pretoria, or whether it's like outside of the borders of South Africa.
So movement. I'll start with Lwazi Lubanzi. So the idea of Lwazi Lubanzi, which actually means like limitless knowledge, is to bring the arts into schools, into public schools, and schools in townships and rural areas. And so far, what we've done is work with schools and townships and have writing workshops and performance workshop and sort of share the knowledge about the writing opportunities in the country and have them access that. So the idea is to build a bridge, and I think maybe the movement there would be the movement of knowledge, the creating a space where we can share knowledge, creating a space where young writers can write and feel affirmed in that practice. So I think that will be how I would explain movement, and then movement in terms of exchanges. I really also believe in writers actually doing these exchanges amongst themselves. Like, we don't always have to wait for an institution to be like, come to this place and do this. And if it's possible to actually do it amongst ourselves, I can come to Nigeria and we can spend 2 weeks or a week writing. And these are things that still need money. So how do we do that by ourselves? How do we keep creating even if we don't have grants, even if we don't have scholarships? How do we keep creating? That is like a question that is always keeping me up at night, because I want to, whatever is happening, I want to create, and I want to be able to do that even if I don't have any backing and any support, so that the work that I'm creating is not always reliant on who is paying my bills, And when I speak about like the exchanges among artists, my friend and I, my best friend Olile Mabuza, she's also a poet and a writer. We collaborated with an artist in Lesotho, Ntabiseng Teriro, and what we did was that we put up money together, like our small little coins, and we got into a taxi and we went to Lesotho. If you don't know Lesotho, like, it's a country that is inside South Africa.
It's a small, beautiful country.
It's so beautiful. It snows there. It really snows. And they are on the mountains. It's my favorite place. Yeah, and then we got there and then we performed piece. No one was paying us. No one was backing us up. We performed pieces. We shared poems. We exchanged. We learned more about Lesotho. We came with our artwork. We sold. We went back home. So even if it doesn't have to be in different countries, it can be you and your friend. You can collaborate, you can make something So it's just like, what do we have in our position to make the work that we want to make right now? And I think the key to that is always collaboration, is community. It's, being open to failing, to doing it and failing, to doing it and then if okay, now I'm also like trying to write grants and to get my work funded. But I'm gonna wait. And what do I do while I'm waiting? How do I keep
Mm,
creating? I just want to make the art at the end of the day.
thank you.
Yeah, but I also want to get paid for it.
But that was very beautiful. It's really beautiful. The need to always collaborate. And what do we do when we wait?
Mm.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's tough and sometimes not practical, but it's, there's always something you can do. It can be a little thing. It can just be
Yeah.
editing one poem. Doesn't have to be like big, whatnot. It can be like exchanging poems. I edit your work, you edit mine. Things like that.
So speaking of what you do while you're waiting, or in this case, maybe while you're just doing, what have you been working on here? You can just leave it at that. That's a great answer.
That's an interesting one.
I love the mystery of that. Well, we can all wonder what that meant.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, but it's interesting. I think like the beauty of residencies sometimes might not also be writing. It might be soaking up things. I find that when I go to residencies, I just read a lot. I make friends. I try to understand what people are doing, and then I go home
Yes.
and the writing just appears.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for
Yeah.
validating my experience.
Yeah, no, you don't need to feel bad about. I mean, we know when we're setting this up because this has been happening for a long time. Like, I personally am surprised when someone says that they have been writing a lot because I
Yeah.
think that
I-
what
I-
you're describing.
I am
feels more
too.
like it. Yeah, like
Yeah.
it's a weird place to write. It's a weird thing to fly across the world and then meet a whole bunch of people and be in an unfamiliar environment in a hotel that may be nothing like the sort of place that you prefer to write. All your routines destroyed, everything that you usually do removed from your life, and now you're supposed to work, right? Which, like, for me, my writing is so routine driven. I'm confident I would get no writing done during this. I would read, I would learn things. It would, like you're saying, it would fuel the writing when I got home.
I'm alright.
But that's it, right? Like, it would not happen here.
I had a theory, and my theory involves two things. I can sleep anywhere and everywhere. It doesn't matter what's happening. I can sleep. And then I can write.
I feel you. I feel you on that. I can sleep on this chair right now.
Right. I once fell asleep in a train, standing, holding on to the pole. Listen, I can sleep anywhere. And then I also think I can write anywhere. Like, I can just write. Like, I don't depend on the environment. And I will say I have been writing in the residency, but it hasn't, like, I write and I move on from whatever I wrote. And then I write and mind you, I'm writing short fiction while I'm here. So most of the stories are incomplete, and they exist in this world where incomplete stories exist, and I never get to finish them. So I'm always like, oh, have I been writing? But my fingers are tingling and I type in, and that's it. That's what I've been doing.
Do you think that's a very poet thing? Because it's like almost every poet I know wants to write a novel or a short story or whatever. And I would say, of all the people I've talked to who wants to write, prose, including myself, I think only about 5-6% have actually completed it.
Oh my God.
So everybody's just writing like these beautiful sentences, and then midway you realize that, oh well, fiction doesn't have to do with reading alone or beauty alone. That has to do with the rigor of how people actually interact, which I think poets don't do well. So
I love short fiction. I am obsessed
that's interesting.
with short fiction. And I think actually, I would like to say, poets make good fiction writers, and maybe that's like the delusion I like to live in, so that I can.
The ones who complete it.
Yeah. Okay, I have one completed short story that is published. So
I think I
it's
read
a
it.
beginning.
I read it.
You read it?
It was
Oh.
beautiful. It was beautiful.
This is a subject of some resentment for me because I know so many people, and they're mostly self-loathing prose writers
Yeah.
who say poets are always the best writers of fiction because they write all the prettiest sentences. And it always makes me a little bit crazy because it's like I want the prose writers I know to love themselves enough to believe that they know how to do anything, right? And like they
Yes.
don't. Like it is actually like a skill in and of itself. But that said,
Oh my
a
god.
lot of the time when a poet writes something and it gets finished, it is good. I mean,
Yeah.
that's true.
Yeah.
I would also like to say, like, the fiction writers, they do have something good that I'm not done. No, if I'm not there, then it feels awkward. But like, okay, the fiction writers, they do have something good going on that I envy,
Yeah.
and is that like, I feel like prose also needs like a certain level of simplicity, and
Oh wow. Okay.
yeah, and like and clarity, simplicity and clarity. Like
Yeah.
the work has to be open. We're so I envy that so much, because I'm like trying to explain that the character was angry, and why am I writing a poem about a character's anger?
I know.
And sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. So just like that practicality that fiction prose writers have with language is what I really, really envy.
I mean, they also have discipline, which is one thing I realized. They
Yes.
sit down and they just write. And in my head, I'm like, how do you do this? Because I mostly write my book in 3-4 weeks and I just play around the year. I'm like,
Yeah. And I actually, you know, when I was starting to write short fiction, I was always on YouTube being like, tips for writers. But one of the beautiful tips that I got was like, you sort of schedule time to write. I don't remember who said this, but then during that time you can either write or do nothing. It's fine if you don't do anything. You can't scroll on your phone or go on the internet. You can either type or handwrite or do nothing. And if you do nothing, you just sit and stare at the wall or your blank page, and eventually you get bored enough, then it's better to write. That has worked for me.
Yeah.
oh, wow.
Yeah. No, it's that's great.
I'll try that and see.
Try it.
It works.
You get bored, you're like, "Ugh." And then you can't, as long as you treat this time interval that it doesn't even have to be long. You can write 1,000 words in 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Or even less. So it doesn't have to be like
I
a
know.
long time frame, but you have to honor it. You can only do two things. It's either you're writing or you're doing nothing, and anything outside of that, you're not honoring.
So this leads to like my own last question because I know where there's time, but there's no time. But anyway, when I hear you talking about prose, there's this kind of like, oh, the ability to sit with like ugliness, which I think prose writers do a lot.
Mm.
Why for poetry, there's this need to write through ugliness into beauty.
Mm.
And I keep, because once we were talking, I was thinking about it and I was thinking about your work. I was like, this is going to be my last question if I keep quiet. And I was like, there's so much like trauma and pain, but there's also so much gesturing through like beauty,
Mm.
whether it's like through language, through reading, and a whole lot that goes in your work.
Mm.
So I'm like, how do you achieve that? Because it's a very difficult thing to achieve. Like writing towards beauty, it's so it's like this tenderness. It's a space in which everything breaks down and kind of like this phonics, like
Mm.
something comes up, and what comes up for you after that writing, and what has that done for you, um, as a writer and specifically as a poet?
Yeah. You know, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of this analogy, and it might not even work, but now that I'm thinking of it, I must share it.
Okay.
You know, like with cartoons, and then like they run over a cliff and they run and they're in the air.
Yeah. Wile E. Coyote is hanging. He hasn't looked down yet, so he doesn't
Yeah.
fall yet.
So he's on the air. And once they look down, then they start falling.
Yeah.
I think some of the things that have to do with writing, I am doing it. And once I start thinking, how am I doing this? That's when I crash. So I am doing it, and I just have to keep doing it without questioning myself. There will be a later me who's an editor who will try and say, no, this doesn't make sense. You can't keep running on air for like a whole poem or whatever, and then try to shelter the piece. And so I think in that kind of discovery where I allow myself to just discover what I'm creating, some of it that I tend to discover would be the beauty. Even if I thought I was writing a poem that is like sitting in grief, then I just keep going and uncovering and unfolding, and in there is like a beauty or some bit of hope. So I would say it's not intentional, and every time I've tried to be intentional about it, I was falling down the cliff.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
yeah,
Thank you.
I don't know much about technique, and technique.
I mean, this is not a question, but for someone who claim not to know much about technique, your poems are doing what they need to do.
Oh, thank you for that.
I think we can end it there. I think this is a good place to stop.
Yes, I think it is. Or else we can talk forever.
Yes, those are the two options.
Officially my first,
We can either stop or keep going.
this is officially my first time as a podcast co-host.
Oh my god, you were amazing.
You did great. You did great.
You did so good.
Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna stop recording.
Yeah. Oh my god, that was so much fun. Uma lishona ilanga sizoqale lethu ngamalahle ngezinkunyi nangomlilo. Uma lishona libomvu ezansi lisithele ezintabeni sizoqale lethu elivutha ubusuku bonke. Obumnyama buzozithoba. Lo mhlaba uzofunda ukuthi nezinkanyezi ziyakhula otshanini. Phakathi kwamabili umhlabathi uzokhanya njengesibhakabhaka. Izimpisi nezinyamazane zoswela ugodi losithelo. Inkantolo ivikela amabhubezi. Biza lamadoda ayizilwane. Isigwebo sabo sibalindile. Biza namadoda angenacala. Isigwebo sabo sibalindile. Ukuthula kwabo kuyicala. Ngendlela bavala amehlo, bafihla izindlebe, bagoba amakhanda ngayo kuyicala. Biza umongameli, inkosi, umphathi sitolo. Sizophawula ukuthi lesihlalo asinagazi. Lo mphakathi uzobhidlizwa iqinise lingaziwa. Amanga ayawugqilaza umphefumulo. Ungalifihla lamampela, kodwa uzothi uma uzama ukukhuluma, uvele ukhonkothe, uhambe njengenja. Isikhumba sakho semvu siwele ethuneni. Ulindeni ungakhulumi. Ulinde ithuna elinegama laziyo. Ulinde kufe bani. Konke okulahlekile kuzobuya. Bonke abalahlekile bazobuya. Sizolotha lelanga izinhlungu zishe, izinhlungu zibe yitshe. Ubumnyama obunyonyo bayo buzonyezela. Lo mhlabathi uzokhanya njengesibhakabhaka. Sizofika la usifihle khona.
Say the World, an international writing podcast, is a production of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. IWP programming is primarily funded by the University of Iowa and the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, with additional funding provided by organizations like the Doris Duke Foundation, as well as donors like you. If you'd like to donate to the IWP, go to bit.ly/IWP-support. Links to further information and additional credits for this episode are in the show notes.